answer that, I want to show you something. The one thing every crisis of this nature has in common, starting with Greece. Now, ancient Greece is considered the cradle of Western civilization. The Greeks brought us mathematics, medicine, philosophy, democracy, and they were rich. Even their dead were once buried with gold. Yet today, many Greeks can't afford their heating bill. They burn fires to stay warm. It's so commonplace, their cities are filled with giant clouds of smoke, including Athens itself. What's worse, many can't even afford the wood needed for those fires. Some have to burn furniture, shoes, and clothing. I told you a moment ago I'd show you something, and this is it. The Greeks were prosperous. They were inventive like nothing we've seen before or since, and not just in ancient times. Even in the 20th century, Greece's economy was growing faster than America's at one point. But then, their cost of living went up. Suddenly, they're burning couches in the streets. Can you imagine being in that position? Can you imagine falling that far? Maybe you can't. Not yet. Until recently, neither could the Venezuelans. Today, it's a third world hellhole. But not long ago, Venezuela was the fourth wealthiest nation in the world, far ahead of Greece, far ahead of Germany, the UK, Italy. Venezuela was once 12 times richer than China. The 41st Vice President of the US, Nelson Rockefeller, honeymooned in Venezuela for 17 days. He brought a team of press and photographers along. Now fast forward to the present, and it's a hellscape. Trucks are robbed at gunpoint, not for money or gold, but for corn. Much like the Greeks who can't afford heating, many Venezuelans can't afford food. By 2016, a carton of eggs there cost the equivalent of $150. The same thing happened just before the Soviet Union collapsed, which surprised even the CIA at the time, though we predicted it well in advance. Food prices were so high, the average Soviet had to work 10 times as long as Americans for a single pound of meat. In the Roman Empire, one of the greatest powers the world has ever seen, prices surged by 1,000% at one time. At its worst point, families would abandon newborn infants in the street, and they couldn't afford to feed them. Now, see, these examples all have one big thing in common. In each case, most citizens could no longer afford to live. That's the unifying factor in every major collapse since the dawn of humankind. Prices of everyday goods spiking. Now, should the price of common necessities surge too high too fast, as it did in Greece and Venezuela and the Soviet Union and even the Roman Empire, it spells disaster. That's how in the blink of an eye, prestigious nations like Greece turned into Zimbabwe. We've seen it over and over and over throughout world history. And until recently, if you asked me if it could ever happen here, I would have said, no way, not anytime soon. But now it's clear, if nothing changes, a scenario much like the ones I've described here will happen in the United States. Now, as I mentioned, a strange event just occurred in our nation's capital, and it set off a chain reaction that will, as the facts and evidence suggest, threaten millions of Americans. We could see the average American unable to afford their grocery bills, many homes opting out of electricity or running water to save on utilities, some losing their homes altogether, and violence on American soil that could reach levels we haven't seen since the Civil War. Now, I get it, this doesn't sound real, but the truth is it's already happening. Desperate Americans are already waiting 12 hours in line for food, not at restaurants, at food banks. But get this, in at least one US city, Dallas, Texas, 40% of the people receiving food handouts, 40% of the people in a 12-hour-long bread line had never been there before. Our country is spiraling out of control. And as bad as this is, it could get much worse. It's critical you learn the truth now so you can protect yourself from what's coming. The following knowledge will completely reshape the way you save and grow your money for the rest of your life. In 2008, as many of you recall, our economy was moments away from complete collapse, as reported by The New Yorker, which writes of the day the economy almost died. One prominent trader stated, "I don't think I've ever been this nervous in my career. I think we were real close to the abyss." And it was at this time that the Federal Reserve experimented with an odd trick to manipulate our economy, one it had never tried before. It was first used in desperation by Japan in March 2001, as that country neared its own financial disaster. And for the longest time, economists and financial experts dismissed this trick as third world monetary policy. They warned it would collapse the economy and currency of any country that used it. But now, one after another, out of sheer desperation, these so-called experts are changing their tune. You don't have to be an economist to understand how this trick works. It's simple. Imagine if, instead of owing your credit card balance to a company, you owed it to your wife. Well, that would be free money, right? Even if you paid the balance off, you'd just be paying your wife. She could hand it right back to you. Today, something similar is happening at the highest levels of US government. As you know, millions of Americans have been decimated by the economic damage of the coronavirus. And to stave off total collapse, the federal government has been forced to take desperate action. Interest rates have plummeted, evictions paused, and Congress even went so far as depositing checks directly into American bank accounts. Yet, look around. Americans are still piling into food lines. Millions are still jobless. The country still sits on the edge. So what can the federal government do when these desperate measures aren't enough? If you don't know, neither does the Federal Reserve. They appear to be out of ideas. And they have no choice. They have to try this bizarre Japanese technique, no matter the consequences. Now, this is bad news for you and me. And for reasons I'll share soon, it's about to get even worse. It's officially called quantitative easing, or QE for short. You may have heard of it. Now, QE itself isn't the story here. The real story is something much bigger. And there's a reason that QE hasn't caused a big problem so far, and there's a reason that's about to change. Now, as a quick refresher on how it works, think of it this way. Quantitative easing is like a desperate stimulus check made out to Wall Street and big investors. First, the Treasury Department forces big banks to buy its bonds. Then the Federal Reserve buys those bonds back. The result? Wall Street gets hundreds of billions of dollars, and the government now owes itself money, like owing your credit balance to your wife. It's a win for Wall Street, and it's a win for the government. But here's the problem. It's a loss for the American people, and it's incredibly dangerous. See, quantitative easing raises the price of stocks, but the catch is it also raises the price of everything else, like bread, gas, medicine. If it gets out of control, think back to Venezuela, where armed robbers attacked corn trucks. Recall the price of heating in Greece or meat in the Soviet Union. That is what happens when too much new money floods into the market and when prices get out of control. Now, we haven't seen this in America yet for one big reason. The Federal Reserve has always capped its quantitative easing. It's only bought a limited amount of bonds at one time, not a dollar more. If it didn't hold itself back, if it kept pumping money into the markets infinitely, well, just look at the numbers. Days after the US announced quantitative easing for the first time in November 2008, look at what happened to food prices. Now, keep in mind, this was a very limited use of quantitative easing. The Fed put strict limits on how much debt it would buy. Yet the price of corn was already up 16% from the beginning of the month. Wheat was up 12%, soybeans up 10%, all in less than 30 days with very limited amounts of easing. To be clear, in the same month quantitative easing was first announced in this country, corn outperformed the S&P 500 by over 15%. For any student of world history, alarm bells would be ringing at the sight of that. But then, look at what happened when the Fed started its second round of quantitative easing. Yes, even after the first price spike, they used it again years later in November of 2010. And from October 31st, 2010 to January 2011, wheat prices went up a staggering 27%. Now keep in mind, 2011 was the same year the Occupy Wall Street movement started. But it doesn't stop there. In that same time window, sugar went up 23%, and sure enough, rice was up too. I could go on and on. These are drastic price increases on the most basic staples on Earth. And these price increases aren't happening over years or decades. They're happening in mere weeks. Can you see now why quantitative easing is clearly dangerous? If it can do that much damage in less than a month, imagine what it could do over years. And get this, right now, the Fed is unleashing another round of quantitative easing as we speak. And what's worse, for reasons I'll share soon, this latest round is infinitely more dangerous than any that have come before it. Those earlier rounds were, as we now know, just the beginning. But it's one thing to see the prices of food going up. It's another to understand what it really means. And before I show you why this latest round of QE is so bad, I want to take a moment here to explain the real consequences of soaring prices in America. On one hand, Wall Street and well-positioned investors receive immense stimulus and wealth. Now, sure, the price of wheat technically rises for everyone. Everyone's grocery bill and electricity bill gets higher. But the right side makes a lot of money from the deal. The Fed is essentially writing them massive checks, pumping stocks and other investments full of money. So big investors don't feel the price increase at all. It might even feel like a price decrease for them. On the other hand, for the millions of Americans who have little or nothing invested, or for Americans in the wrong investments, they're simply caught footing the bill for the upper class's fortune. They're paying more, but not making more. Put another way, if quantitative easing goes unchecked, the rich get much richer, the poor get much poorer, and the middle class dissolves. Your fortunes either go up with the rich or go down with the poor, depending on where you put your money. And now you're about to see this firsthand. Something terrible is happening in this country, and you're finally ready to hear what it is. To be clear, what I'm about to reveal is not a prediction. It's already underway. Remember, elites are stampeding out of America because they know a crisis is coming. But here's why. The final stronghold, the last thing standing between us and the kind of price surges characterizing world downfalls since the dawn of man, has just been shattered. The Federal Reserve has declared unequivocally and without remorse, it will keep quantitative easing running indefinitely. No more limits. The safeguard that held quantitative easing back, possibly the one thing that helped keep it from spiking prices too high and decimating American society, is gone. The Fed has stated outright it will buy assets in the amounts needed. That's a quote, the amounts needed, no dollar cap, no time limit, and it appears to the Federal Reserve the effects may not matter. A Fed Chairman Jerome Powell states, quote, "It is not a first order concern for us that too high inflation may be coming our way." It's from Jerome Powell, the Fed Chairman. Now, too high inflation is a fancy way of saying sky high prices. And as you've learned here, this suggests the absolute worst case scenario now lies ahead. You saw what happened when the Fed did just a little bit of QE. Imagine what's in store for us now that they're keeping it going, on and on, presumably for years or even decades. All the dangers I've shared with you, all the criticisms of quantitative easing, they're all on the table when QE has no end in sight. Our only hope was the Federal Reserve's restraint. And with that restraint gone, there is realistically only one outcome as I see it. There's no turning back. For Americans who don't take the right steps now, I fear the worst. But you must be wondering, why on earth would the Fed do this? Why would they adopt monetary policy in line with Zimbabwe? You may assume they have a good reason, and they do have a reason, but it's probably not what you or I would call good. Now, first, academic types mess things up all the time. Book smarts seldom align with common sense, as you know. But second, and more importantly, remember how the Fed's performance is graded today. It's how the markets are doing, not how the average American is doing. The Fed is not made up of elected officials, and all anyone seems to care about is what the colors of the arrows are on CNBC. So why wouldn't the Fed pour all its support into the markets, even at the expense of the common American? According to Andrew Hazard, the man who apologized for quantitative easing, the Fed's main concern these days isn't the American people, it's the newest survey of financial market expectations. Plus, of course, in-person feedback from Wall Street bankers. It's no wonder the Washington Post writes,